So this is a video on the mill exam that we took, and let me say that every exam is like an experiment. The teacher is not really sure about what they've been able to get across and what would be reasonable for to ask their students. It's a kind of a guess, and I'll let you know about the particular questions that I thought might have been a little bit of a misfire on my part, but let me just tell you that when it comes to actually formulating grades, I take those things into account, or at least I try. That being said, I think some of the questions were quite straightforward. Most of them were. Explain why utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. The important thing to see here is that consequentialism is the wider category, and that utilitarianism is the narrower one. So that consequentialism is any moral theory that says that the moral value of an action depends upon its results or consequences. So utilitarianism, important to see that utilitarianism says that, well, the important thing that matters is the effects on human happiness. So that is one type of consequence to take into account. But the basic idea is that because utilitarianism thinks that an action is right or wrong depending upon its effects on human welfare or happiness or unhappiness, then it is a form of consequentialism because that's a kind of result, the effect on human happiness. Question 2, explain why utilitarianism is a form of hedonism. Hedonism is any philosophy that says that the greatest good is pleasure, or the good itself is pleasure. And because utilitarianism says that the only good is happiness, happiness is pleasure, utilitarianism is by definition a form of hedonism. Question 3, what is the greatest happiness principle or principle of utility? It was just what I just wanted you to basically tell me what Mill says there. That actions are right insofar as they tend to promote happiness, wrong insofar as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. That's the essential thing. And then by happiness is meant pleasure. By the reverse of happiness is meant pain. That's just what I wanted you to. It's just something that's so basic that I thought it would be a good thing to ask. It's not really an interpretation. You're not asked to be given to give an interpretation. You're just asked to basically say what the principle is. Number 4, how does Mill respond to the objection that to say that pleasure is the summum bonum, the greatest good, is degrading to human nature? Well, the way to go here is the way that he goes and say that it's not degrading because human beings have a great range of different pleasures that they are capable of, not just the so-called lower pleasures, which we share with the animals, but a whole range of pleasures, including pleasures of the intellect, pleasures of feeling imagination, and even he says pleasures of moral, the moral pleasures, the pleasures of moral action. So it's not degrading because of the array of human pleasures, and especially because of the existence of the so-called higher pleasures that he mentions. Number 5, Mill claims that the higher pleasures are more pleasurable and more desirable than the lower ones. What does he say is the proof of this? It's pretty simple. It's preference. Ask people who know both, that is, who've experienced both the higher pleasures and the lower pleasures, and ask them which one they prefer. And he says invariably they will say the higher pleasure. So that's the only proof, really, is preference on the part of those who know both. Number 6, what does Mill say is the ultimate sanction of the greatest happiness morality? And the answer to this is really a feeling, a subjective feeling. It is a difficult question, I think. But that is the answer. That is, the greatest happiness morality is the commitment to other people's welfare in what you do, taking their happiness and their welfare into account. The ultimate sanction of that would be what is it that gives that its binding force, that actually can make us do that or give us the motive to do that. That is to take into account the greatest happiness, not just our own. And he says it's a subjective feeling, that it would feel wrong not to. And so the ultimate sanction for it, the ultimate motive for it, internal, which is an internal sanction, is a subjective feeling. It gives us pleasure to do it, or it would pain us not to do it. This is where things, I think, maybe got a little. I mean, why is it difficult, if not impossible, to prove first principles? That is not a question in ethics. It's a question about logic. And yes, it's very relevant to what Mill was getting at, especially in his chapter about the difficulties of proving the principle of utility. Believe me, I took it into account that this might have been a question that came out of left field. Some people answered it quite well, but most people didn't. I mean, they really didn't know what I was talking about. So, believe me, I don't. I think it goes both ways in a test. The teacher has to ask something that's reasonable, and if nobody knows what they're talking about, what the teacher's talking about, then maybe it's not reasonable. So, believe me, when I formulated grades for this exam, certainly took that into account. Why is it difficult, if not impossible, to prove first principles? First principles are starting points in our thought, and they are the foundation, let's say, of a study or science, like mathematics or science, or natural science, or morality, as far as Mill is concerned. They are the starting points. They are the things that we use to establish everything else. So to establish them might be impossible. That's why, classically speaking, philosophers have said that first principles are self-evidently true. They don't need proof. So to actually prove them they're so deeply entrenched in our thought, first of all, that we never think of proving them. But then if we try to prove them, we find that we don't have anything prior to them to prove them by. That's the answer I was looking for. And I think it was reasonable when I wrote the question. Obviously, I thought it was reasonable. It might have been that we just didn't go into that logic enough depth to make it a reasonable question for the exam. So some people did get it right, but most people didn't. And I definitely took that into account when I came up with the actual letter grade. This was really an open-ended question, but also quite difficult. It went in different ways. Explain why education is such an important topic in Mill's moral philosophy. Some good answers went in the direction of, well, if we're going to have the greatest happiness, that is, the greatest amount of happiness for all in a society, then education is incredibly important, because it's education that allows you to experience the higher pleasures, which he says are more intrinsically pleasurable. That was a good direction to go in. Another direction to go in was the cultivation of the feelings. That is, with regard to the so-called greatest happiness morality, the idea that in morality we must take into account the happiness of others. In fact, we must put them on the same level of importance as our own individual happiness. That getting into that habit, let's say, of feeling, having a subjective feeling for the greatest happiness morality, that you need to cultivate your feelings. In other words, you need an education. So there were two different ways you could go with this, I thought, but it turned out to be kind of a difficult question, I think. And I definitely kept that in mind when I formulated final grades. As always, after you've looked at this video and you still have questions about the exam and you'd like to go over your exam in particular, just contact me.